Sometimes you just want to say, start it. Don't throw all these boxes at me before you start it. But anyway, that's the way they design the software. So Cleanthes then relates in Hume's book. Okay, folks, again, it's louder than you think. Relates the design argument that we just went over, right? The world, the thought was that even, you've heard things like the harmony of the spheres, or even the planets, that they're so accurately put together that it's like the universe is a big machine. But the world we live in is a big machine subdivided into a number of smaller machines. So here we're talking, what? The organs of plants and animals. And all machines and their parts are accurately adjusted to one another, like the watch, right? So throughout nature means that is the way various organs and stuff are put together, are adapted to ends, that is the purposes they serve. So here's where purpose comes in. By the way, the other argument, the other name used for the design argument comes from the Greek word for purpose, telos, T-E-L-O-S. It's also called the teleological argument because of the importance of things being designed for a purpose. So means, that is the way various organs are put together, are adapted to ends, the purposes they serve, like to enable us to see or hear or other things, in ways that resemble yet exceed the products of human design. So there you've got the premises. So you can say, well, if the products of the design have those similarities, then by analogy, we can conclude that they may have had a similar cause, right? Something like Hume doesn't use the watch. Paley did. Hume uses things like ships and houses as man-made things, but he makes the same point, right? So the idea is, if something like a watch needed a designer, so would something like the eye. So the author of nature, which is just another word for God, right? We can conclude then probably is an intelligence, has a mind like the human mind, but God has a much greater mind. That's what he means by saying has larger faculties. Because the products of divine design, like the brain and the eye and the ear, are much more complex than anything we build, right? So the conclusion is that God exists and has a mind similar to the human mind, is an intelligence. Now, Damia doesn't like the design argument. Remember, Damia in Hume's dialogue is like a very simple, straightforward faith would be a fundamentalist Christian. He doesn't like it that the argument is based on experience. It's a posteriori. And also depends on observing similarities between God and man, like that God has intelligence and plans things. And here's the thing. The design argument, no matter how strong it is, can only give us at best a probable conclusion. The design argument basically says if the products of human design have intricate parts that work together to serve purposes, then probably things in nature that share those similarities also have a designer, namely God. So it can never give us anything more than a probable conclusion at best. Now, which is what Damien doesn't like. He would like to see an a priori rationalist argument for God, like the ontological argument. But Hume, in the person of Philo, remember Philo, the character Philo in the again, the name of Hume's book is Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion. Okay, whether it's called natural religion or what Paley calls it, natural theology, that was titled Paley's book, it's the same thing. But Philo says, I'm not worried that it's a probabilistic argument, because he says, you know what? Some probabilistic arguments are actually very good arguments. Hume was a pretty good logician. He says, but what he objects to is he thinks that the design argument is weak because it tries, the way we would say it today colloquially is it tries to compare apples with oranges. That the things being compared in the design argument for Hume are not as similar as they're claimed to be. So he says, look, there are other probabilistic arguments that are very strong because we've seen a number of similar cases, right? I was watching a cable over a friend's house, and they had this show about people prospecting for gems out west. And here are these guys, and they think they've got a good place to dig for, I forget exactly which gemstone they were trying to dig up. But right above them, there was this precariously positioned rock, and they were afraid throughout the dig that the thing could roll down. Right? We know what happens to a rock that's pushed downhill or given a push. It's going to roll downhill because we've seen it happen many times. That fire will burn. Or consider a book or a box of ordinary matches, right? When you take the second match out, you expect it to do the same thing the first match did. That is, light when you strike it on the striker. Why? Because you've seen it hundreds of times. In other words, how do you know that this match is going to light? Because you're comparing many similar cases, or that the earth is solid. He says these are based on thousands of observations of cases that are very similar, if not exactly similar. But here's where, Hume says, but look, we only have at best one examples of design. Now look, people today, and if you read that thing on the fine-tuning argument, there are people who talk about the possibility of parallel universes. When I was growing up with a kid, sometimes science fiction writers would talk about that. But today you actually have some logicians and physicists talking seriously about those possibilities of something more than just science fiction. But parallel universes weren't even considered in Hume's day. So Hume says, look, we only have one example of a universe. I mean, there used to be a kind of a joke final exam that professors used to talk about that only had two questions. Question one was describe the universe, and question two is provide two examples, right? Well, if Hume is right, we don't have more than one example we can provide. So only one example of design our present universe. And he says this might be a weak analogy because we're not comparing similar things. Now, here's where Hume does something that's a good thing to do. Hume knows that some of the people who are going to read his book aren't going to quite understand what arguments from analogy are supposed to do or how they can go wrong. So the probabilistic arguments, they can be strong if you're comparing similar things like two matches out of the same box, but they can be very weak if the things you're comparing are not very similar at all. And Hume says analogies can even lead us to wrong conclusions if the things we're comparing are different enough. So here he educates his readers by saying, look, if we depart from the similarity of the compared cases, this diminishes the evidence the support gives to the conclusion in an argument from analogy. In other words, the more similar the things you're comparing, the stronger is your argument from analogy. The more unlike they are, the weaker is your argument from analogy. And he gives an example of the circulation of human blood, right? He says, look, if I want to draw a conclusion about how blood circulates in another human being from the way it's observed to circulate in me or some other human being, where we're comparing two exactly similar things, blood circulation in two human bodies, he says beyond doubt we can conclude this. It's a very strong argument from analogy. But he says, even if we weaken the argument, and I don't know, some people told me they still do these experiments where you literally dissect a live frog, and they open the thing up and you see the little heart beating. I mean, I was in biology class when we did this. And he says, well, it's a presumption, but a strong presumption to conclude that blood circulation, things like fishes and frogs, is similar because they are, they're animals. But now Hume says, suppose we compare things that are very different. Now, one of my disappointments in going up to Connecticut was I thought, the leaves ought to be at their peak there. That it ought to be a really pretty trip. Well, I was up there, and the temperatures were between 75 and 80 degrees this weekend. It's like they've been almost as warm up there in Connecticut as we are. So their leaves they're a little more advanced than ours, but they're not anywhere near peak. So why bring that up? Well, I learned in biology class that sap goes up into the tree in the spring, but then it recedes into the roots in the fall, the time we are now, and takes with it some other nutrients, takes the chlorophyll and leaves the xanthophyll and carotene, and that's what turns the leaves yellow and orange. In other words, he says, there are some similarities between sap in vegetables and blood in a human body or the body of an animal. They're both liquid. They both flow through little tubules. But he says it would be wrong to conclude that sap circulates in vegetables the way blood circulates in a human body, because it doesn't. You know, and so what is Hume saying? He's saying not just that you might have a weak argument from analogy if you're comparing two things that aren't similar at all, but if you're comparing two things that aren't very much alike, you may be led into a false conclusion, like that sap circulates in vegetables. Now, what's behind this, right? Here's Hume, the religious skeptic. He's either an atheist or a strong agnostic, right? So what is he thinking? Well, the design argument may lead you to think there's a designer. And for Hume, that would be probably a false conclusion, or certainly not a very strongly supported conclusion. So, similar effects, similar causes, right? We basically compare things. The date for my house, the building date that's listed on the paperwork is 1900. You say, well, that's interesting that it was built in exactly 1900. Well, the right answer is it wasn't built in exactly 1900. But I don't know if any of you heard about the Great Baltimore Fire. I think it happened around 1904, 1905. All the records of houses like mine that are old and date back to the 1800s were burned up in the fire. Nobody knows when my house was built, right? But Hume says, on seeing a house, we conclude with the greatest certainty that it had a builder. Well, just because we don't know who built my house or when they built it, I don't think that it suddenly sprang up spontaneously on that lot, right? I can conclude, because of its similarity with other houses, that if they needed a designer and builder, mine certainly must have as well. And that would be a pretty doggone strong conclusion, right? As I said, it didn't just spontaneously spring up on the lot. So even though the records have been lost, I have no problem concluding that it had a builder. So it says houses we've observed in the past have had to have builders, so this one must have had one too. But Hume tries to say, if we're talking about the universe as a whole, and of course that's the claim of the design argument, is that the universe as a whole is the product of design. He's saying, first of all, we only have one case to go from. Second of all, he says, how similar is the universe itself to some made object like a house? And now, here's where I'm asking it to be autonomous. Hume says, at least to him, they don't seem similar at all. So he says, it's only a presumption that the universe had a similar cause to that of the house, namely a designer and builder. He says, all we get, because we're not comparing things that are very much alike, is a guess, a conjecture, a presumption. Again, these pages refer to a different text, so just disregard them. Let me go back. So Hume tries to argue that it's a weak analogy, but, again, see, Cleanthes brings up the eye later on. And you say, well, yeah, okay, Hume, but what about some of the things we find in nature? Which, now remember, Paley's writing after Hume. Hume probably Hume's book was written in the late 1700s. Paley gets out his natural theology for the first time in 1802. And Paley read and understood Hume. So Philo and Cleanthes then agree. Now here's where we make a shift. Here's Hume's other point. He says, suppose we do have observed order in the works of nature. He says there are other explanations for that order than direct planned design. Okay? He says something's a product of design only if we can show that the order, the arrangement, the adjustment to final causes are teleological causes. They're purposes. So that's what he means. The adjustment of final causes is the adjustment of the parts of the thing to serve a particular purpose. So now Hume is not a scientist, but he knows, he has a sort of educated person's understanding of the basic science of his day, right? Hume's writing in the 1700s. And so Hume doesn't give us an airtight scientific theory, but he speculates maybe some internal cause in matter itself can be taken to be responsible for the order that we see. Anybody ever buy rock candy or make it at home? You know what rock candy is? I mean, it's a really healthy snack for your child. It's basically solid sugar. It's sugar crystals. I had a chemistry book when I was in like middle school that told you how to make old-fashioned rock candy. They used to sell it in stores. Sometimes you can buy it in throwback stores like you find in Cracker Barrel. And basically, what you do is you heat water and you dissolve a ton of sugar in it. And you know from your chemistry that if you heat a liquid up, you can dissolve a lot more in it. And then what you do is you hang a string from something and let it go down into that liquid with all the dissolved sugar. And then when it cools, that stuff gets precipitated out in crystalline form and you get little sugar crystals. So here are ordered crystals, but that order, while it might look like it was designed, that order comes from elements in nature. So Hume says maybe the elements in nature may fall into some exquisite arrangement by some unknown internal cause. We still have about 7 or 8 minutes. Actually about 5 or 6. I'm keeping an eye on the time. So he says this is as easy to conceive as that the divine mind is the cause of their arrangement. And I say, note the similarity to later claims of Darwinism. So here's what Darwin would say. Here's the alternative, right? What is the Darwinian story of evolution as an entirely natural process? A probabilistic process with respect to something like the eye. Well, it's that you have survival of the fittest. You have some members of the species that adapt better to their environment than others, and some of them develop what Darwin called advantageous variations, mutations that actually serve them better in the struggle, the constant struggle for survival. That's why evolution talks about the survival of the fittest. And the story is those members of the species with these developed advantageous variations have a leg up in the struggle for survival, and nature selects them to continue on and develop further, and the lesser members of that species are selected for extinction by what is called natural selection. And so evolution's story is organisms with more and more complex eyes developed over millions of years through an entirely natural process, right? And so Hume anticipates Darwinism by saying, well, there are other causal forces in nature like heat and cold. That's what's responsible for our crystal formation. But he knows about other forces in nature like magnetism. Again, these are things that an educated person in the 1700s would know about the science of the day. So he says design is only one of these things. Some things in nature affect others by design, but he says it's illegitimate to reason that all of them do. It wrongly goes from a part to a whole, like drawing conclusions about the generation of a human being from that of a hare. Of course, Hume wouldn't have known anything about cloning, you know. He wouldn't know that you could clone a dinosaur, right, from the strands of DNA left in a fossilized mosquito in amber. That's the premise of Jurassic Park. If there's anyone in the class who hasn't seen those movies 5 or 10 times. So, okay, there's not many more points that he makes. I got 2 minutes. So Cleanthes says there are millions of examples of design, and I would ask you, Hume says we're comparing apples and oranges, but does Paley have a better assessment of that when he says, no, what we're comparing is some things in nature that obviously have parts that work together to serve purposes like the eye, to a made object like a watch, or for Hume, So Cleanthes gives various examples. Now, I'm going to make this last point. Okay, we only have 2 minutes, so let me make this last point quickly. What Hume tries to say is, even if we suppose the world were perfect, which he says it's not, he thinks it's a wrong argument to be asked to conclude from a very imperfect world that its designer must have been perfect and infinite rather than imperfect and finite. But he says, suppose we assume, though, that the creation was perfect, like, say, a perfectly made ship, he says we could not necessarily have to conclude that the designer was perfect. He says somebody who didn't know much about building ships at all, but who was a mechanic, like a carpenter who just imitated others and copied an art. And that's what I do with these PowerPoints, right? I don't have any artistic talent. I can't draw a graphic like that, but I'm a stupid mechanic who knows how to cut and paste, stuff into a PowerPoint slide, right? But you can't conclude that I'm a great artist because of the illustrations in these. So he says the maker, you can't conclude, even from a perfect world, that its maker must be perfect. So he says we can't get Aquinas's and Paley's conclusion. But he also says we can't even conclude that there's only one maker, since ships and houses are usually designed and built by many. So Hume says the design argument doesn't even entitle us to conclude that there's only one designer. There could be a committee of lesser gods with a little g, rather than one omnipotent God. And plus, he even goes further. He says, look, if you're going to give God human-like attributes, why not go all the way like the Greeks did and suppose that the gods reproduce sexually and that there's a genealogy? Why not assert with Epicurus that reason must have human form, since no one has seen a rational person? So, at any rate, so Hume basically concludes that the only thing we can get from the design argument is that the universe was a product of something like design. Everything else, he says, is just weak conjecture. Okay, so you can read the specifics of these slides. And he even gives the Brahmin view that the world was spun by a spider as another outlandish option. Okay, folks, thank you very much. We're going to go on to the next item in the syllabus, which I think might be the problem of evil. So take care. Okay, if anybody missed the roll, yeah, just set it down there and there's a pen. Okay. Have a good day. Again, get that supplement.